Hello, welcome to my coronavirus classroom. I'm Janessa Jacobs, and this is the Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. So the thing about anatomy and physiology is there's a lot of information. You're going to learn about a lot of systems, and you have to learn a new language. So this whole first chapter kind of works you around that. And one of the things that we also need to be aware of is that the body is full of muscles and bones. This may be humorous, but there's nothing funny about the skeletal system. So there are 206 bones in the skeletal system, and you have to memorize all of them. That's why we're starting now, so that by the time we get to the end of the semester, you already have most of them, if not all of them, in your back pocket. Fortunately, a lot of bones we clump together. So sure, they all have different names. This is true rib 1, this is rib 12. So, but they're all ribs. And like these, they're all carpals. And you don't have to memorize all the carpals in this class. Some schools would make you, but we don't really. Shh, it's our secret. So yeah, we'll get to that. You'll see, it's not as bad as you think, but it isn't funny. It's no joke. That's why we're starting today. So this is the humerus, and it is the long bone of your arm. This is your arm. This is your forearm. Any questions? Yeah, so this is the long bone of your arm, and you are going to have to be able to identify whether a humerus is a left or a right humerus. And you're saying to me, how on earth am I going to do that when I am sitting at home in my living room looking at some silly picture from your crazy lab assistant? And I'm going to tell you that if you're looking at it like this big dip right here is pretty darn distinct. That goes posterior. So, okay, that goes to the back. Well then, the other marking that is going to help me orient is the head of the humerus right here. So if this is posterior and this is the head, this has to face medially in the body. So just imagine that. Could you imagine you like that? With that thing posterior? The olecranon fossa is the technical name. I need to get professional. So can you imagine your olecranon fossa posterior and this nice rounded surface medial? I hope so, because this is a right humerus. And so, okay, the markings that I need to be able to identify that are going to help me find my way around it. Well, the head and the olecranon fossa, the first and the last, I think are the two that you can look for to tell which one you're looking at. If you don't see the olecranon fossa on your picture, but instead see these weird things, okay, this is anterior, here's the head. Could I imagine my weird things? Oh, it's hard for me to get that way right here, but yeah, I could. Well, I could imagine my weird things there in the head of my humerus going medially. I could see that this is still my right humerus. So what are these weird things here? Head, shaft. Up here, the markings that you need to know are the greater and lesser tuberosities. Tuberosities, trochanters, epicondyles, what else? They are attachment points for muscles or tendons, or ligaments, so just be aware of that. So we've got our greater and lesser tuberosity up on the superior or proximal aspect of the humerus, and then on the inferior or distal aspect of the humerus, I have these weird articulating structures. And usually if I've got nice, flat, smooth articulating surfaces, I call that a condyle. And so if these were nice and smooth, they would be condyles. They're not, so they get weird names. We're going to go over in a minute. But epi means upon. Epicondyles are more attachment points for ligaments or tendons. So you can, if you want to, you can start looking at bone markings now just to start seeing what they're doing. But these are both examples of attachment points. So the medial epicondyle is right here. If the head of the humerus has to face medially, then this is the medial epicondyle. And it is sitting on what, if it was nice and smooth, would be called a condyle, but it's not nice and smooth, it's weird, and that's the trochlea. So the trochlea is going to articulate with this bone in our forearm called the ulna, and the ulna is going to grab it and allow you to flex and extend your arm. The other bone in your forearm is called the radius, and it's going to radiate around this part here. This is the capitulum, and your radius is going to rotate around that. So, head, shaft, greater and lesser tuberosities, medial epicondyle, trochlea, capitulum, olecranon fossa. You can do it, I'm leaving you. Use your mastering AMP. Look at the models, look at the dissections, look at whatever resources are available to you, because we have to make do with this kind of crazy situation. But we will, it'll work. Okay, so biceps brachii is going to be our most powerful forearm flexor. Our forearm is here, our arm is here, and so its action is to flex the forearm and supinate the forearm. So in anatomical position, I can hold a cup of soup. My hand is supinated. If I'm pronated and I want to supinate, then my biceps brachii can do that. So it flexes my forearm and supinates my forearm. So in supination, my radius and my ulna are parallel. We'll talk about those for our bones of the day next time. So biceps brachii here, here. All right, so let's do our muscle meditation. And we're going to breathe in biceps brachii, and breathe out flexes forearm, supinates forearm. And breathe in biceps brachii, and breathe out flexes forearm, supinates forearm. And breathe in biceps brachii, and breathe out flexes forearm, supinates forearm. And breathe in biceps brachii, and breathe out flexes forearm, supinates forearm. And breathe in biceps brachii, and breathe out flexes forearm, supinates forearm. And breathe in biceps brachii, and breathe out flexes forearm, supinates forearm. And breathe in biceps brachii, and breathe out flexes forearm, supinates forearm. Anatomy and physiology is a specialization of the larger science, biology. Biology is the study of life and living organisms, and anatomy and physiology really specifically looks at certain aspects of life, the structures that living organisms have, and the functions of those structures. So biology, the study of life. And anatomy and physiology are specialties in biology that are studying specific structure. In the case of anatomy, anatomy studies structure. Physiology studies function. So you can kind of split these two things up, but not really, and not for very long. So you could just study anatomy or just study structure, sure. You would not be able to study physiology without knowing anatomy. So, and it's really kind of silly to know a bunch of structures without thinking about what they do, because if you know what they are and how they're working, then it actually just leads to the function. So really the sciences are intertwined. But if we wanted to say, well, we can split them up a little bit based on structure and function, what are different branches of anatomy? Well, we have like microanatomy, which is everything that you cannot see with your eye, so it requires a microscope. So this would be like cells and tissues, or cytology and histology. So microanatomy is going to require a microscope. We could also talk about macroanatomy or gross anatomy. So gross anatomy uses the unaided eye. And so what could we see with our unaided eye? We could see organs, We could think about the anatomy of, like, you know, the cardiovascular system and the organs in that. But really, anatomy is kind of, I don't know, best when you look at everything large and small. So gross anatomy is everything that you're going to see with your unaided eyes, like your organs, your organ systems. Well, I guess you could observe the whole organism, which is a bunch of structures coming together to form a big structure. So that's going to be big stuff that you can see. Physiology, as far as physiology goes, there is so much physiology, and so it is just like huge, all of the functions that happen in all of these different systems. So you can't really like specialize in all of the physiology. Instead, what you do is you pick something that you love and you specialize in that. So you could look at like cardiovascular physiology, or so you could be a cardiologist, or you could look at, you know, you're interested in the kidneys or something, so you could be a urologist. So physiology really is going to be broken down by system. So this is really kind of like study systems, or like pathophysiology, which studies disease. So if we're looking, we could say like cardiology for systems, or you could study disease, the functions, the processes involved in disease. So we could study disease. So for example, pathophysiology. Other types of anatomy, I guess, that I didn't mention. You could also look at like developmental anatomy. So how do structures develop? Kind of pretty cool. And then the two systems really are linked. So anatomy studies the structures in living organisms, and physiology studies the processes or the functions of those structures in living organisms, so that we can see what are all of these structures, these organs and organ systems, how do they come together in an organism to give us life? What are all of the processes that are occurring to give us life? So life is something that you should have talked about in Gen Bio, so you should have a general idea about the characteristics of life. But what we can say is that, you know, what am I talking about? What are the characteristics? Well, like to be alive, you have to maintain boundaries, you've got to excrete waste, you have to do metabolism, all that stuff. So that's all general bio stuff. This is kind of another general bio topic, but we'll review it as it's going to relate to what we're talking about. So life is organized. And what does that mean? Well, it follows these levels of organization. And the lowest level of organization in a living organism is the chemical level of organization. And this is what chemists study. And if we look into the chemical level of organization, this is all of our like atoms that come together to form molecules. And we're not really going to talk about atoms and molecules. Well, this is not a chemistry class, this is an anatomy class. These atoms are going to come together to form molecules. The molecules are going to come together to form organelles. Organelles are going to come together to form cells. So the cellular level of organization is really where we're going to start looking at stuff in the body. We'll talk about how some of our cells are using ions and things, which is kind of chemical, but we're not going to talk about how those ions are formed or any of that chemistry that they would do at the chemical level. So the cellular level is the level of organization that is composed of cells. So here we have cells that are made of organelles. And we will do a very brief review of cells. We're not going to talk about chapter 2 at all. We'll talk a little bit about cells as far as just a quick review of structures, but I do want to talk about cell transport. That's going to be important for us. So we'll talk a little bit about chapter 3. Where we're really going to start getting nitty-gritty is when we get to tissues. Tissues, the tissue level of organization, is the level where we have 2 or more cell types working together to perform some similar function. What are those tissues going to form? An organ. We'll get there in a minute. But at our tissue level, we've got 2 or more cells working together and performing a similar function. So right now we're looking at stratified squamous epithelial tissue at the surface of my skin. Skin is an organ. So right underneath this stratified squamous epithelial tissue, I've got areolar connective tissue and then dense irregular connective tissue. So those tissues are going to come together to form an organ, which is the next level of organization. So in an organ, we could say this is when we have two or more tissues working together and forming the organ. So what you'll see is that we tend to have an epithelial tissue lining the organ, and then we'll have some connective tissue that's serving that epithelial tissue, and then we'll have some muscle of some sort, and then we'll have some more connective tissue that holds the whole organ together. That tends to be the general way of things. An epithelial tissue, a muscular tissue, and a connective tissue will come together to form an organ. So like your heart is an organ of your cardiovascular system. Your lungs are organs of your respiratory system. So they've got multiple tissue types that come together to form those organs. And then when we get multiple organs coming together to perform a vital life function as part of a system, that's an organ system. So organ system is when we have multiple organs working together to carry out a vital life function. Multiple organs working together to carry out a vital life function. And so for this first test, we're going to talk about the cellular level a little bit. We're going to talk about the language of anatomy and physiology right now. We're going to talk about tissues. And so we've got epithelial tissues, connective tissues, we've got nervous tissues that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. When we get to some of our organ systems is when we'll talk more about, like, when we get to the skeletal system, we'll talk more about bone tissue. When we get to the muscular system, we'll talk more about muscular tissue. So it's all going to come together, but this semester, we're going to have an introduction to these tissues, and then we're going to look at some organ systems, and then we'll finish out the rest of the organ systems in the second semester, and all of those organ systems are going to come together to give rise to the organism. So what are the organ systems that we're going to talk about? Well, the first organ system is the integumentary system. Now this is in order of presentation by your book. This is not the order that we're going to go in class. We're going to talk about the nervous system first. And that's because the nervous system is your major controller. The other major controller is your endocrine system. We'll talk about that for the first system next semester. But the nervous system is hard, whether you learn it now or whether you learn it later. And I'd rather have you learn it now because it's controlling everything else that we learn. If we start here with integument, then I'll tell you about sensory receptors and just like tell you maybe a little bit about what they do. But if you have no concept of where those sensory receptors are leading and through the nerves through which they're going and what it's doing in the brain, then it doesn't really matter to you to first talk about the sensory receptors in the integument. But if we talk first about the nervous system and then work our way back through the other systems, it's really super cool. So we'll go right now talking about our organ systems in the order that books present it, but that's not how class is going to go. So the first system is the integumentary system. This is your skin, your hair, and your nails. The next system that most books talk about then is the skeletal system. Skeletal. And this, of course, is your bones and your joints and the cartilages that we find between them. And then we have our muscular system. This is your skeletal muscles that attach to bones. We're going to talk about those together at the very end of the semester. Actually, at the very end, we're going to have a little quick half a test on the autonomic nervous system because that helps with your knowledge for next semester. And then from here, most books then go into the nervous system, which is where we're going to start. So this will be all of the systems that we cover in the first semester of anatomy and physiology. In the second semester, we will start with the endocrine system. And then I continue and do the reproductive system, but that is what most classes do last. The reproductive system is totally controlled by the endocrine system, so I'd rather just handle them at the same time. But if you're looking through the order of your book, we go from the endocrine system to blood. Blood is a tissue. It's the only fluid tissue in your body, but it gets its whole own chapter because it's the tissue that's flowing throughout the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system has your heart and your blood vessels, which have different chapters. And then from there, we will talk about the lymphatic system, which most people don't even know exists. And then we'll talk about the immune system, the respiratory system, the digestive and urinary systems. And that's where we will finish off. So all of those organ systems are going to come together to give rise to the organism. We are going to be talking about human anatomy and physiology and studying the human organism. There is a lab component to this class, and so we will be using the cat as the basis for that. And cats are quadrupeds, so we'll learn a little bit of different language to talk about cats. And so we'll talk about them as organisms a little bit, but really what we're studying is the physiology and the life of human beings. So those are the systems, and that's where we will be going. So let's move on. All right, so I have a quick question for you. The simplest level of organization in the human body is the blank: atomic, B, molecular, C, chemical, D, all of the above. It's the chemical level. And you might say to me, yeah, but the chemical level is made up of the atomic and the molecular level. And I would say it sure is, but the simplest level of organization is the chemical level. So sure, chemicals are made up of atoms, but the simplest level of organization is the chemical level. Okay, and chemists study that and what's going on. So chemicals come together to form our organelles that we find in our cells. This is really where we're going to start looking at things, is at the cellular level. Okay, so even though we kind of try and split up anatomy and physiology and say, okay, these are all of the organs that we find in the organ systems, or these are all of the cells that we see in the tissues, anatomy could just look at all of that stuff, but physiology really has to look at all of that stuff and what is it doing. And then, sure, we could say, yeah, we could split up all of these different organ systems and look at them individually. Absolutely. But all of them work together to give rise to an organism. So really, all of our systems are truly interrelated. And so how? Why? What am I talking about? Well, if these are my blood vessels, I've got my heart that is pumping blood throughout my circulatory system. So that's my circulatory system, my heart and my blood vessels, the organs pumping blood. This blood is bringing my oxygen and my nutrients to my tissues of all of my other systems, and all of my tissues are then giving all of their wastes to this blood. So this blood then goes to my kidneys, and my kidneys pull out all of these wastes, and then I excrete the waste from my urinary system. So there's my urinary system helping my cardiovascular system, well, my whole body, by pulling wastes out of my blood. Okay, well, what about my digestive system? That's got my stomach, that's going to do my digestion, and my small intestine, which is going to bring nutrients into my blood so that I can get those to the tissues. Well, how did I get this oxygen? I got this oxygen by breathing it into my lungs through my respiratory system. So my cardiovascular system helped there because my blood vessels brought this blood to the lungs where I could have nutrient and gas exchange there, pick up my oxygen, take it to the tissues. So really, all of my systems are working together. So really, even though we're going to talk about all of the systems separately, they are truly integrated and truly related. So I will try and bring it together for you always so that you can see how the systems are working together and how all of your learning is building on everything else. It's going to be great. Okay. So, homeostasis is something that you should have talked about in your Gen Bio class, but we're going to talk about it now. It's going to be really important because homeostasis is what keeps you healthy and functioning and alive. If we look at homeostasis, the word basically means same. And what we're doing here is trying to keep the body the same. What do you mean, the same thing? Well, what we want is to keep the body in a relatively stable environment despite continuously changing external variables. So to do that, we're going to have some homeostatic control mechanisms in place. But homeostasis is what we're always trying to shoot for, this kind of range within which we're going to keep various variables so that we can maintain health. So homeostasis, really, if we're looking at a good definition, a nice, good, solid scientific definition, we could say this is maintaining a relatively stable internal environment despite a continuously changing external environment. So for homeostasis, we maintain a relatively stable internal environment despite continuously changing external conditions. It could be internal too. So homeostasis, as far as homeostasis then goes, we can move toward or away from homeostasis. Staying in homeostasis is what's going to keep you well. Moving out of homeostasis or being out of homeostasis for a long period of time leads to aging and disease and disorder. So let's talk about homeostatic control mechanisms. So these are ways that the body can move you to or away from some homeostatic set point. So homeostatic control mechanisms, they will move a system or the body, whatever it is, or variable, whatever it is we're talking about, toward or away from homeostasis. Now wait a minute. I just said we wanted to stay the same. We wanted to maintain a relatively stable environment despite continuously changing external variables. So why would I ever want to move away from homeostasis in the body? Well, I don't want to a whole lot, but there are a couple of times when I do need to, like in labor and delivery and so on and so forth. So we'll talk about those in a minute. General homeostatic control mechanisms are ways that we're going to move a system or the body or some variable toward or away from homeostasis. Okay, so in every homeostatic control mechanism, we're going to have three players: a receptor, a control center, and an effector. There's going to be some change, right? So let's just imagine that we are sitting here at homeostasis. This is homeostasis. Okay? And so let's say I've got some change that moves me away from homeostasis. And so like I come up to here and now I'm here. Okay, now I'm out of homeostasis. How am I going to come back down? And what was this? What was this? This is some change in a variable or a stimulus that's detected by the first part of my homeostatic control mechanism, a receptor. So we have some stimulus, and what this is just a change in a variable. What are you talking about, lady? What's a variable? This isn't a math class. A variable is anything you can measure, and this is not a math class, but we can measure things like body temperature, we could measure things like hormone level, we could measure things like heart rate. So anything that we can measure in the body is going to be a variable and it can change. So if we come out of homeostasis, we're going to need to get back. And well, most of the time, we're going to want to come back. And so we'll look at how we do that in just a minute. So any change in a variable is the stimulus. And what are variables? Anything we can measure. So it could be something like body temperature or like hormone level, heart rate, anything we can measure. Okay, so there will be some change in a variable. This is going to be detected by the receptor. This is the first part in the homeostatic control mechanism. The receptor is going to detect a change. So it detects, it detects the change. So it's responding to the stimulus. What's it going to do? It's going to tell the control center about it. So it's going to send this information along what's called an afferent pathway to the control center. So the receptor detects the change and is going to alerts the control center. So this information is transferring along, or is being transmitted along what we call an afferent pathway, or this is afferent information. And we're going to see these words, afferent and efferent, multiple times. Afferent approaches, that's how I remembered it, A, approaches. So it's bringing it in. Efferent exits. Oh. Efferent exits. So our efferent pathway is going to take the command away from our control center to our effector. We're going to talk about in a minute. But that's how we're going to remember which way the information is going. So our receptor is going to detect some change in a variable, and it's going to send this information about this change along an afferent pathway to the control center. What's the control center going to do? It's going to integrate all of the incoming information from all of the receptors in the body and decide what to do about it. So we say it integrates the information and initiates change. Initiate. Does that mean bring about the change? No, it initiates change. It starts the message that's going to tell the next thing what to do so that it can bring about the change. The control center integrates all incoming information. And it's going to decide what to do and initiate change. It decides what to do and it initiates change. Initiates change. Change what? Weren't we responding to a change? We were. And now we need to cause a change to come back to homeostasis. Or maybe move away from homeostasis. We'll see. We're going to have some kind of change that's going to be brought about. And it's initiating it, which means starts, by sending a command to the effector, who's going to bring about the change. That command is going to go through our efferent pathway. So we'll say it initiates change by sends an efferent command to the effector, which is the last part in any homeostatic control mechanism. The effector is going to be the thing that brings about change to return us to homeostasis or move us away, depending on which type of homeostatic control mechanism we're looking at. So the effector is going to respond to this message and brings about change. In class, I would say, any questions? So think about it, process it. If you have a question, put it in the discussion board. So, homeostatic control mechanisms. Every system has some homeostatic set point, is keeping us in homeostasis in some way. So we're going to talk about homeostasis and homeostatic control mechanisms over and over and over throughout both semesters. All right, so we have two types of homeostatic control mechanisms. negative feedback, which is going to move you toward homeostasis, and positive feedback, which is going to move you away from homeostasis. So we want to be in homeostasis. That's what keeps us healthy. So there are very few examples of positive feedback in the body. And a lot of times if you have positive feedback loops running like unregulated, it can lead to disease. So homeostasis is really, really important, and we're going to look at both types of feedback mechanisms throughout both semesters. And I actually have some assistants who help with the instruction of both of those types. So this is Chip. He is going to be teaching us negative feedback throughout the semester, and this is Good, and Good will be helping with positive feedback throughout the semester. So I'm going to let them have a discussion with you right now about the basics of these two types of homeostatic control mechanisms. Anatomy Corner by Janessa Jacobs. It begins. Negative feedback. Can we please address the elephant in the room? Which is the fact that negative feedback is a good thing. Yeah, so? Well, negative feedback should be mine, you know, because it's good. Yeah, but it's negative feedback. Yeah, but it's good. Yeah, but it's negative feedback. Grr, I know, but it's a good thing. And I'm good. Are you? Yes. Arr. Yeah, but it's my comic. I would argue it's our comic, and this is the professor's class anyway, so your statement is irrelevant. Is it? Arr, yes. So the comic is mine and negative feedback is mine. Get over it. It's fine. Rise above or something. I also get negative feedback because it can be confusing. Devils are all about confusion. So, negative feedback will always bring you back to the ideal set point. If you are too high in something or too low in something, negative feedback will get you to where you need to be. Maybe you should talk about the components of the system, you know, to help. That's not my jam. Do you want to talk about it? You know, since I get all of the attention. Yes! So, the sensor, also known as the receptor, will sense that something changed. What? Anything! Temperature, blood pH, blood glucose, hormones, all of it. Okay, calm down. Okay, negative feedback is great. I know. So, the sensor tells the control center about the change, and the control center decides what to do about it. The effector will then do something to bring us back to the set point. Homeostasis is restored, and all is good. Punny. Welcome to Anatomy Corner by Janessa Jacobs. It begins. Positive feedback. Okay, now let's talk positive feedback. Are you going to let me tell what the components in the system are doing? No, positive feedback is mine. But I gave you negative feedback. Yeah, but you get everything. Get over it. So, now the sensor is going to detect the change and tell the control center. But now the control center is going to tell the effector to amplify the change. And you will move further from homeostasis. When does it end, and why would you want it? It ends when the stimulus is gone. And you want it to do stuff like, say, stop bleeding, reproduce. Pretty important. Some would say you want it to conduct an action potential. Stimulating. Nice pun. I know. I can't wait to tell you all about the specifics in class. See you soon. All right, so as you heard, negative feedback moves you toward homeostasis. So it's actually a good thing. Negative feedback moves you toward homeostasis. And now the thing that can get confusing here is that it doesn't just have to be less than, it doesn't go in that direction, and it's not a bad thing. So the word negative here can kind of trip people up sometimes. Negative feedback is going to come into play if you're ever too high or too low on a variable. If your body temperature is too low, negative feedback brings you back up. If it's too high, negative feedback brings you back down. Same thing like testosterone. If your testosterone is too high, then negative feedback will bring you back down. If your testosterone is too low, negative feedback will bring you back up. So negative feedback is really good. This is moving you toward homeostasis, and it's really, really, really important. This is what's keeping you healthy and well. So if negative feedback moves you toward homeostasis, what does this mean? What are some examples of this? Well, like in your house, you've got your thermostat, which is monitoring your temperature, right? So if it gets too cold, you come outside of homeostasis, negative feedback will move you back. So who would be the receptor in that system? It's your thermostat that's detecting the change in temperature, right? This is actually interesting because then who's going to be the control center? It's also the thermostat. The thermostat is going to pay attention to that change, and it's going to now send out the message to the effector to bring us back up to homeostasis or get us warmer. So who's the effector? The furnace. Okay. So that's also kind of how it works in the body. Sometimes the control center is the same as the receptor, but sometimes it's not. In the case of body temperature regulation, it's not. So let's think about this for body temperature. You have a normal set point for body temperature, which is our average temperature, which should be 98.6 degrees, right? So this is our set point. And sure, you can come a little higher or a little lower before anything gets problematic, but you can't come too much higher or too much lower. If you get too high, you're going to start burning the system up. If you get too low, you're going to freeze. So what are the things that we can do when we come out of homeostasis? So to bring us back to normal. So negative feedback is going to be engaged. So let's say that it's hot. It's a hot day. And so your body temperature increases and you come up to, let's say, I don't know, you're outside jogging, it's hot, you get up to 101 degrees. What's going to happen? So the stimulus is an increase in temperature. So this is going to be detected by our receptor. And in this case, it's going to be thermoreceptors in your skin. So we've got different thermoreceptors for hot and cold. So we'll feel that it's hot. The receptor will say will be these hot thermoreceptors in your skin. And they're going to detect this. And they're going to send this information along an afferent pathway to the control center. And in this case, it's the thermoregulatory region in your brain. It's called the hypothalamus. So we're going to tell the hypothalamus, who is the control center, we're too hot. So what's the hypothalamus going to do? It's going to take in all of that information and it's going to send out some commands along an efferent pathway. So these are efferent information coming to our effectors, which are going to be able to bring about some change to hopefully bring us back down to 98.6 degrees. So what happens to you when you get too hot? You start sweating, right? So that's going to be one thing that we can do is we can turn on our sweat glands. So the sweat glands are one effector. The message is turn on. So we start sweating and we lose heat through evaporative cooling. The other thing that we can do is we can stimulate our blood vessels. And what our blood vessels will do is they're going to dilate in the skin and they're going to bring all this hot blood to the surface of the skin so that in combination with these sweat glands being on, we're going to lose heat through evaporative cooling. And hopefully come back to homeostasis. And that is negative feedback. So negative feedback moves us back to homeostasis. All right, well, what about the opposite? What about it's too cold? So you're outside and you're skiing and you stop, your ski breaks, you're like start to get out there and it's like freezing and you were sweating because you were working out and then your ski broke. So now your wet skin is getting extra cold. What's gonna happen? What happens to you when you get cold? You shiver, right? So, okay, that's the effector. How do we get there? What's the whole pathway? Well, we have a decrease in temperature. We came below 98.6. So what's going to happen? The stimulus is a drop in temperature that's going to be detected by our cold thermoreceptors in our skin. So they are still thermoreceptors, but they're cold. So we get a drop in temperature. This is detected by our receptors, which are cold thermoreceptors. And they're going to tell the hypothalamus, who's the control center, and it's going to send out an efferent message to my effectors. And what am I going to do? What do you do when you're cold? You shiver. So my skeletal muscles are the effectors. A byproduct of cellular respiration is heat. So if I contract my skeletal muscles and I make them work, then they're going to give off heat and hopefully bring me back up to homeostasis. So my skeletal muscles will contract and I shiver. The other thing that I can do is I can constrict those blood vessels and bring this warm blood away from my periphery and into my vital organs. So I can constrict my blood vessels so that my warm blood comes into my body where it's needed. So that's still negative feedback. I was too cold. It was detected by cold receptors in my skin, told the thermoregulatory center in my brain, my hypothalamus, who sent out this efferent message to my skeletal muscles, caused them to contract. I shivered, generated some heat, and I constricted my blood vessels to bring that warm blood into my body. So that's negative feedback. Positive feedback moves you away from homeostasis. And as far as normal examples of positive feedback in the body go, and what do I mean by normal? In that they're not leading to disease. There are normal examples of positive feedback that are still moving you away from homeostasis, but it's for a purpose. So there's only one example that works in both males and females, and that's what's called platelet plug formation, when you have a bleed, you nick a blood vessel and you're trying to form a clot. So that's one thing that works in both males and females. All the other examples of positive feedback are in the female reproductive system. So labor and delivery is a positive feedback loop. Lactation is a positive feedback loop. The first half of the ovarian cycle is under a positive feedback loop. So positive feedback loop moves you away from homeostasis, but it's generally for a purpose. All right, so positive feedback is going to move you away from homeostasis, which is kind of weird, but what positive feedback does is it amplifies a response so that something's going to happen and we're going to get more of it and more of it and more of it until the stimulus is gone. So really the only normal examples that we have are in the case of part of the process involved in stopping bleeding is called platelet plug formation, where platelets will stick to a damaged blood vessel and secrete chemicals that attract more platelets, that secrete chemicals that attract more platelets, that secrete chemicals that attract more platelets. That's what happens in both males and females. That's the only example of positive feedback in males. In females, we have positive feedback throughout the follicular phase of the ovary, as well as really the easiest kind of example, I think, for most people to understand of positive feedback, what happens when labor and delivery. And then positive feedback is also involved in lactation. So we'll talk more about all of that when we get to the reproductive system, but I'll just give you the example of what happens with labor and delivery right now, because that one I think is it's potent and it's easy for people to understand. So at the end of gestation, you may have heard, oh, the baby dropped. And what that means is that the baby dropped. And so a lot of times you'll see a woman and she'll have a big basketball belly at the end of gestation. It's up here. And then the next time you see her and it's like down here. What happened is the baby dropped. That's going to be the stimulus that helps to start sensitize her body so that she can be ready for this positive feedback loop that's going to happen so that she can deliver this baby. So the stimulus is pressure on the cervix. So the baby drops and puts pressure on the cervix. That is going to be a neural stimulus that goes up to the hypothalamus, and is going to cause it to release this hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is really important. It's involved in bonding, but it's also really important for stimulating reproductive smooth muscle contraction. So oxytocin will enter the blood and hit the uterus, and the uterus will contract and push on that baby. And that baby is going to push and cause pressure on the cervix. And that pressure on the cervix is going to cause the hypothalamus to release more oxytocin, which is going to cause the uterus to contract and push on that baby. And that baby's head is going to push on that cervix. So I get more pressure on that cervix, causes more oxytocin release, causes more uterine contraction, causes more pressure on the cervix, causes more oxytocin release, causes more uterine contraction, so forth and so on until the baby is born. And then this is going to remove the baby, the placenta gets born, we remove the stimulus, and the positive feedback loop shuts down. Okay, so positive feedback moves you away from homeostasis, and the feedback loop will end once the stimulus is removed from the system. So in the case of labor and delivery, once the placenta is born, that will end. Then we'll start a positive feedback loop for lactation. What will happen then is that oxytocin is going to inhibit the inhibitor for prolactin, a woman will start making milk. The baby suckles, that causes the oxytocin to stimulate milk letdown, so that suckling is neural stimulation, causes oxytocin release, causes milk letdown. So the milk ejects into the baby's mouth and it suckles more. And that's going to cause that more suckling, causes more oxytocin release, causes more ejection. So that positive feedback loop will go until a woman weans her offspring. And then in the case of platelet plug formation, as I said, more platelets will stick to the collagen, secrete chemicals that attract more platelets. And we'll talk all about more of that stuff next semester. But for now, we need to be aware of homeostatic control mechanisms, then know that negative feedback moves us toward homeostasis, positive feedback moves us away from homeostasis, it's amplifying the original response. So not only do you have to learn all these systems and all the organs and all the functions, you have to learn the language. It's actually a new language, and you're going to have to learn anatomical position, some directions, some directional terms. You're going to have to memorize a bunch of body regions and body terms. But this is the only time we're going to talk about it specifically. And it's going to be hugely important throughout the rest of both semesters. So on your first quiz or your first exam, there could be a high points question that's asking you to label all of the different body regions or something, or identify all the different body regions, or give me the anatomical name for the location of your forehead. And you have to know them. So I'm always surprised when students are shocked. I'll get some kind of feedback like, oh, I was surprised that the body regions were so heavily tested when we didn't talk about it that much. Well, we're going to talk about it the entire semester and all of next semester too, as it relates to anatomy and physiology. I'm going to introduce it to you, the language. I'm going to introduce you to the language today. You're going to make note cards and you're going to start memorizing it. And then I'm just going to start talking to you and using these words from now on. So if I were to say something like, oh, well, I could really use some deodorant in my axillary region, then I would expect you to know that this is my axillary region. Where else would I put deodorant? I don't know. Maybe you got stinky knee pits. I don't know. That would be the popliteal region, and they're generally not stinky. They're never called knee pits. But yeah, so this is the only time we're going to talk about it, but don't just think, oh, I can watch this lecture today and be done. You cannot. You can watch this lecture today and you can start memorizing and making note cards tonight, okay? And then just know what I'm talking about as we move throughout both semesters. So, we're going to start with what's called anatomical position. And we have anatomical position. We use anatomical position as a way to standardize the body so that regardless of how we find an organ or a person or whatever, we can know what we're talking about. What am I talking about? Well, if you walk into a crime scene, let's say, and you've got a person and they are hanging upside down by their foot, and they have, let's say, gunshot wound here in their leg. And then they've got a stab wound here in their chest. So you might walk in and you could say, oh, well, the gunshot wound is above the stab wound. All right, well, what about when I take this person and I lie them down? Like now, what's the relationship? Oh, well, it's next to it. Yeah, well, what about if I stand them up? Now the gunshot wound is below the stab wound. So we're not going to use below and above. And we're not going to think about when the body's upside down. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to think about all bodies from the anatomical position. And this is going, and then we're going to use these specific anatomical directional terms and regional terms to work our way around a body. So as far as what anatomical position is, we could say that this is the standard way to describe a body regardless of its location or position. So standard way to describe a body regardless of its position or location. And what is it? What is anatomical position? It looks like a person standing with their feet parallel and their arms right at their sides with their palms pointing forward. So your feet are about hip distance apart. You can't see my anatomical position. These are the joys of teaching in your living room. Okay, so you can't see my feet still. Just imagine that they're right about hip distance apart, facing forward, and then my hands are so that my thumbs are pointed laterally and my palms are facing anterior. This is anatomical position. Okay? Okay, cool. Then, when I'm in anatomical position, I'm going to have some directional terms that I'm going to use to direct me around the body. These are relative to something else. So I can't just say, oh, my head is superior. Well, which part of your head are you talking about? Are you talking about the frontal region, the mental region, the occipital region, the orbital region? Right? So, because that matters. Like, you can't just say it's superior. Superior means toward the head. My head is toward my head? What part of my head is more toward my head than my head? Well, my frontal region is superior to my mental region. So, directional terms are going to be used to direct you around the body, and they're relative to something else. Superior. You could also say cranial, as a directional term, means toward the head. And so really, for a lot of people, you think about it like as in an upward direction. So some of these words are going to be different in quadrupeds and bipeds. Superior and inferior are not. But this word is going to kind of throw things off, and these words are going to throw things off. So we'll talk about it. Superior means toward the head. So let's just say here's our little kitty right here. Superior is also upward toward the kitty's head. Superior, toward the head. Cranial also works as a directional term toward the head. The weird thing about cranial is this is also a regional term. Regional terms are different than directional terms. Directional terms are directing you around the body. The body has a bunch of different body regions. Those are the other things you have to memorize. So, okay, cranial or superior are both toward the head. Inferior or caudal toward the feet. So I kind of don't like talking about this here because, okay, so this is our person looking at us this way. Now, caudal toward the feet. Caudal, how do I want to say this? Inferior toward the feet. Okay, that's what I want to say for sure. Inferior is toward the feet. In both quadrupeds and bipeds, it's like down toward the feet. Caudal, its opposite is really this other term, rostral. Rostral, and we use this, caudal and rostral, more so in quadrupeds than we do in bipeds. So caudal is more like toward the tail. So for us, it's like inferior, sure, because our tail would be here. So let me draw this other guy who's looking this way. So imagine here's the nose, here's my eye, here's my smile. Caudal for us, toward the tail, is like toward the feet, inferior, but it's also like toward the back, posterior, because caudal is like toward the tail. So caudal, toward the tailbone. Why did I tell you that? Well, because that's what I do. I have to tell you what all these things mean. Its opposite is really rostral, which means toward the nose. So for us, toward the nose is superior and anterior. For quadruped, it's more like just anterior. So rostral, toward the nose. So rostral, toward the nose. Which for us is like superior and anterior. For our quadrupeds, it's more just like anterior, and caudal's more like posterior. It's kind of weird ways to use these words. What are you talking about, anterior and posterior? You didn't write anything down, lady. Well, let's talk about it now. Anterior means toward the front. So toward the front. And posterior, oh, I'm not supposed to be using that lime green marker. I learned that last semester. Sorry about that. Anterior, toward the front. And posterior is toward the back. Okay, so anterior toward the front, posterior toward the back. And it works this way on our quadrupeds as well. Anterior toward the front, posterior toward the back. So anterior, posterior, rostral, caudal, superior, inferior. Okay, what are these other terms here in parentheses? Ventral and dorsal. Well, your ventral cavity is this juicy, gutsy organ cavity here in the front, housing all of your viscera. So for us, ventral is like anterior, toward the front. For quadrupeds, ventral is like inferior, or toward the feet. The dorsal cavity is the cavity that encases your brain and spinal cord. So for us, it's like posterior. But for quadrupeds, it's like a dorsal fin. It's superior. So ventral, toward the ventral cavity. So ventral for us, yes, would be here as anterior. But here, ventral for a quadruped is more like inferior because their ventral cavity is inferior. Dorsal is toward the dorsal cavity, which for us is like posterior, toward the back. But for quadrupeds, animals, like if they have a dorsal fin, it's on the superior surface. So dorsal is more like superior in a quadruped. All right? So those are our first directional terms. Start memorizing them. Note cards are not good for a lot, but they're good for the language of anatomy because it's something new that you have to memorize. So you could make note cards with all of these words right now. Okay, we're not done with directional terms. Medial, lateral, intermediate. Medial is toward the midline. Lateral is away from the midline. So medial, toward the midline. The most medial structures in your body would be like your nose, your chin, your sternum, your navel, your umbilical region. So medial is toward the midline. The most lateral structure when you're in anatomical position would be your thumbs. So lateral is away from the midline. Okay? Intermediate is between a medial and a lateral structure. So if I'm looking at my arm, I could say my shoulder is medial to my elbow. Now this is where it becomes important. These are relative. to stuff. So my hand would then be lateral, the most lateral, and my shoulder is medial, my elbow is intermediate. So I could say my elbow is intermediate to my hand and shoulder. I could say my hand is lateral to my elbow because it's away from the midline. Okay? Whoa! Intermediate. So this is between a lateral and medial structure. We can actually use intermediate in another way. So I'm going to skip ahead. We can use the intermediate here between superficial and deep. Superior? This is not supposed to be superior. Okay, so somebody was tired when they made that PowerPoint slide. So we're going to just pretend. What? Superficial. Okay, so intermediate is between lateral and medial structures, but we can also use intermediate between superficial and deep structures. So superficial structures or external structures are toward the surface. So your skin is superficial. All right, deep, the deepest part in here is my bone, which is internal. But there's something between there, or intermediate, my muscles. So my muscles are intermediate to my skin and bone. My bone is deep to my muscle. My bone is deep to my skin. My skin is superficial to my bone and muscle. My muscle is superficial to my bone. And yeah. So superficial, toward the surface. Deep, away from the surface. Or internal. And then I can also use intermediate in between here. As in between. Intermediate can be between superficial and deep, just like it can be between lateral and medial. Intermediate, between superficial and deep. Superficial, towards the surface. Deep, away from the surface. All right, let's come back up here. Proximal and distal. We tend to use these terms, these directional terms, for the limbs. So proximal is closer to the point of attachment for a limb. The point of attachment for your upper limb is your shoulder. So your shoulder is the most proximal part of your arm. Your elbow is proximal to your hand, but your hand is distal to your elbow, further away. So we're always using it as some from some frame of reference. And proximal will be closer to the point of attachment. And distal will be further from the point of attachment. Okay, so I used medial and lateral on the arm before, but medial and lateral you could also use, like you could say, like my sternum is medial and my shoulder is lateral and the pectoral region is intermediate. So that's how, but I wouldn't use like proximal and distal really to talk about that. So even though I used lateral and medial to talk about the arm, you can use it for the arm, but I can also use proximal and distal for the arm, which I wouldn't use in here, where I could use those other terms. So just be aware of that. Proximal and distal we're really using for the arm and leg. That's not always true, we'll see, but that's we're gonna, right now, like proximal is gonna be closer to the point of attachment, distal is gonna be further from the point of attachment. So you could say like my toes are distal to my ankle. My ankle is proximal to my toes. My knee is proximal to my foot. My foot is distal to my hip, okay? All right. Those are directional terms that are going to guide us around the body, and then the body we're going to talk about in different regional terms. So we're going to split the body into different regions that you have to memorize, and then we're going to use the directional terms to guide us around those regions. So the first divisions of the body that we talk about are the axial and appendicular divisions. And the axial divisions are all of those things that are on the long axis of your body, your head, your neck, and your trunk. So we've got appendicular, which are going to be then the limbs that are attached to the axial division, our legs and arms. And then we have different regional terms that are going to designate specific areas within each of these divisions. What are these regions? This is the thing where, like, if I give you the a test and ask you, I don't know, let's say I just pick 10 of these and throw them on there and say, give me a definition. And you're like, what? We didn't talk about that. You were talking all about tissues for exam 1. Well, I was talking a lot about tissues, sure. But I was also talking about the language of anatomy, which is today, and you have to start memorizing. So do it. The frontal region is this region right here. Your frontal bone is back here. The frontal lobe of your brain is back here. This is the frontal region. Your orbital region is right here. Your orbit, so your bony orbit surrounds your eye. Your nasal region is here, your nose. Your buccal region is your cheeks. Your oral region is your mouth. Your mental region is your chin. Sometimes when men are being very mental, they'll play with their beards, which grows on their chin. Sometimes when I'm being very mental, I play with my labret ring, which is in my chin. Mental region, chin. Cervical region is your neck. Your thoracic region is the chest. The sternal region is right in the middle, surrounding your sternum. You've got pectoral region on either side of that. You could also call that the mammary region. The axillary region is your armpit. If we look over here for different terms for the upper limb, the acromial region is right here. Your brachial region is right here. This is the arm. This is the antecubital region right here. This is the antebrachial region right here, your forearm. Your arm and your forearm are different things. This is the antebrachial region here. This is the carpal region here in your wrist. Your hand is called your manus. The palmar region is right here. In anatomical position, the palmar region is what you see in the front. Your pollex is the fancy name for your thumb. And then this is the digital region here. You have 2 digital regions. You have a digital region on your foot as well. So which digital region you're talking about is going to be context dependent. Okay, in your abdominal cavity, the umbilical region is right in the middle. Here, Alex, come help. So for the abdominal cavity, the umbilical, oh no, what happened? The umbilical region is right here. This is the inguinal region, or the groin, right here. So there's an inguinal cavity right there. It's the inguinal region. The pelvic region is really kind of the lower part of your pelvic cavity here, and the pubic region is really the external genitalia. Let's see, what else? The coxal region is your hip. Femoral region is your thigh. The front of your knee is the patellar region, because that bone is your patella. We'll talk about the back in a minute. The crural region, the front of your leg, is, so this part right here is crural. That's your leg. So this is your thigh, not your leg. So if this is the femoral region, patellar region, crural region, leg. Other things that we can see. The side is the fibular region, or peroneal is right here. The pedal region is the foot. So your tarsal region is your ankle. What else do we need to know? Calcaneals on the back. Metatarsal region we can see up here. And then digital region. Okay. I'm going to start down here and then get off the chair. So, but I forgot, your big toe is hallux. Must be, where's the big toe? I'm covering it up. So your big toe is called your hallux, like your thumb was called your pollux. Your big toe is called your hallux. And so what are other things that we can see on the back from the posterior side? So on the posterior side, your calf is the sural region. So it's crural in the front, fibular or peroneal on the side, it's sural on the back, patellar on the front, popliteal on the back. So popliteal rhymes with heel, rhymes with calcaneal. This is the calcaneal region. This bone here is the doctor is in to fix this lecture. Something happened in recording and a lot of these terms got lost, so we're going to finish them up real quick. And to help, I'm going to use a model instead of just this board. All right, so all of the regions that got lost, I think where we left off in the video was the calcaneal region, which is right here. This bone is the calcaneus under here, and so this is the calcaneal region. And what I was telling you is that calcaneal rhymes with heel, and it's your heel, which rhymes with popliteal, which is the back of the knee. So other things that we can be aware of on the posterior side as far as regions go, the bottom surface of your foot is the plantar surface of your foot. This surface here on the anterior and the top is the dorsal surface of your foot, or the dorsum of your foot. So if we're on the posterior side and you were standing on your tiptoes, you'd see the plantar surface of your foot. Then we have back here is the sural region. This is the fibular or peroneal region. In the front of your leg, this is the crural region. So this is your leg and this is your thigh, and that's different. This is your hip. So in the anterior part of your leg is the crural region. The posterior part of your leg or your calf is your sural region. The lateral aspect is the fibular or peroneal region. And then what else can we see? If we look back here, this is the metacarpal region. So the anterior aspect of your hand is your palmar region, but the posterior aspect of your hand is the metacarpal region. This again is the carpal region. And then we have the antebrachial region. Then we have the olecratal region. This is the brachial region. This is the acromial region. This is the cervical region. This figure is showing us the otic region is the ears. They're also called auricular. The occipital region is the back of the head. In the back, or the dorsal region, we have the scapular region around our scapula. We have the vertebral region around the vertebral column, the lumbar region here, the sacral region down here, the gluteal region down here. The perineal region is found between the gluteal region and the pubic region here in the front. So I think that's all we need to be aware of as far as our different body regions go. So let's go ahead and finish this fix up by talking about our body planes. Planes are imaginary lines that you can just imagine through any body tissue section, whatever. A sagittal plane is going to split whatever you're looking at, like the body, into left and right. So it splits into left and right. And a mid-sagittal plane or a median plane is a plane that splits you into equal left and right portions. So just any old left and right plane is a sagittal plane or a parasagittal plane. But if you're splitting the body or whatever you're talking about in exactly equal left and right portions, then it's a median or a mid-sagittal plane. So this is equal left and right portions. The parasagittal plane, again, is just some kind of left and right. Para means near sagittal. So it's just you're splitting into left and right portions. Okay, so other body planes. Again, planes are imaginary lines. Sections are actual pieces of tissue or images of tissue. So when you're looking at a section, this is an actual image or slice of tissue or an organ or something like that. A plane is an imaginary line. And so we're going to be able to use our body planes to create different kinds of sections. Hold on. Yeah.
My body kind of it's just like flying all around.
Is it? Do you want an applesauce? Yeah? Can you grab it and I'll open it for you?
Yeah.
Okay, grab it.
I just feel a little too much of heavy air in around.
Okay, well I need you to just after I open this applesauce, I'm gonna have you be quiet while you eat it so I can finish this lecture real quick, okay? I have 1, 2, 3 more slides to do, so it won't be that long. Okay, I love you, sweet boy. Oh, I got you cheesy roll-ups. Do you want those? Okay, I'll pause it. All right, so we can imagine lines through other planes. We can imagine lines dividing bodies or organs or tissues into other sections. And so what are those other planes? So if we are splitting the body, organ, or tissue into an anterior and posterior segment, that's a frontal or coronal plane that does that. So both of those words work. A frontal plane or a coronal plane is splitting whatever you're looking at into anterior and posterior. And a transverse or horizontal plane, also called a cross-sectional plane, is going to split whatever you're looking at into superior and inferior segments. So what's weird about this is that you can have a cross-sectional section, and that would just be an actual slice of tissue from the transverse or horizontal or cross-sectional plane. Shh. Just for a minute. So a transverse or horizontal or cross-sectional plane is going to split you into a cross-sectional or transverse or horizontal plane is going to split you or whatever you're looking at into superior and inferior portions. And then an oblique section would be an actual slice of tissue at some weird angle that's not one of these planes. An oblique plane would be an angled plane. Oblique's kind of weird because it's just anything that's at an angle. So that's not a straight line that is splitting you into superior and inferior, or a straight line that is splitting you into anterior and posterior, or a straight line that is splitting you into left and right. So, all right, those are our body planes, and we can take sections from any of those planes. I like looking at cross sections the most, because then you're looking down at it and you get to see what it looks like. Although longitudinal sections can be good sometimes. We didn't talk about that. That's when so that's a whole other issue. I have a quick question for you. So let's have some exercise for our brains. The heart is blank to the thoracic cage. A, medial. B, deep. C, superior. D, all of the above. So the answer here is actually deep. And you might be saying, well, I chose medial. Okay, well, that doesn't really work. Because if you think about it, the thoracic cage is your ribs, your sternum, and your vertebral column, everything that is surrounding your lungs and heart. So your heart sits right in here. So it's not really medial, it's deep, because all of these structures are involved. Okay, next question. Negative feedback mechanisms will be activated when A, you are outside of homeostasis. Oh, this was supposed to come out. B, you get too cold. C, you are delivering a baby. D, all of the above. E, A and B only. Lucky for you, this is here. This is my kind of question you would get in a lecture class. They're real hard. People hate them for the most part, but they're great for your brain. I'm taking them all out because I don't want my questions online. So the questions that you get are questions that are publisher questions. That's what we're reviewing. Sorry about that, but that's how it goes. What do you think this answer is? Negative feedback mechanisms will be activated when? A, you are outside of homeostasis. B, you get too cold. C, you are delivering a baby. D, all of the above. Or E, A and B only. Oh, the answer is A and B only. So if you're delivering a baby, this is a positive feedback loop. If you are outside of homeostasis, negative feedback gets you there. If you are too cold, you are outside of homeostasis, so negative feedback will bring you back up by causing you to shiver. All right, I'm gonna let Janessa take back over. Okay, body cavities. We have a whole bunch of body cavities, but really we're gonna look at the first two body cavities, divisions, and then the subdivisions of each of those. We talked about them a little bit when we were talking about directional terms. Our first major body cavities are the dorsal cavity, and the ventral cavity. The dorsal cavity is the cavity that surrounds your brain and spinal cord. Your brain and your spinal cord are your most vital organs, and what we'll see is that the more vital an organ it is, the more protection it has. So our brain, if we were to look within the dorsal cavity, our brain is surrounded by the cranial cavity, and our spinal cord is surrounded by the vertebral cavity. These are very bony cavities with not a lot of space, and the membranes that protect our brain and spinal cord from these bony structures are called meninges. So we're just going to put that in our pocket for now. Meninges are the membranes of the dorsal cavity. And we'll talk about our meninges when we get to the nervous system. Well, why'd you even bring them up? Because we're going to talk a lot about the membranes in the ventral cavity right now. Okay, so the ventral cavity is this cavity in the front that holds all your juicy organs. It surrounds your thoracic cavity superior to your diaphragm and your abdominal pelvic cavity inferior to your diaphragm. So this is your ventral cavity, and we're going to divide it further, and then we'll talk about the cavities and the membranes in each of these cavities as well. So our ventral cavity, we'll say, surrounds our thoracic cavity and our abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. All right, so we'll talk about the dorsal cavity, the brain, the spinal cord, and meninges a lot more when we get to chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So we'll talk about those later. We're going to talk about all of the organs in the ventral cavity primarily next semester when we get to second semester A&P. So we're going to talk about their membranes right now because we're going to talk about the tissues that make them up, like next class or probably the day after that. Well, we'll see. So in the ventral cavity, the membranes of the organs in the ventral cavity are called serous membranes. And serous membranes reduce friction between our organs, and we'll look at these serous membranes in just a minute. Okay, so ventral body cavity. This houses our internal organs, collectively called the viscera, and we divide it two subdivisions that are separated by the diaphragm. The thoracic cavity is superior to the diaphragm, and the abdominal pelvic cavity is inferior to the diaphragm. So our thoracic cavity, superior to the diaphragm. And if we look in the thoracic cavity, we can further divide it into other cavities that are surrounding organs. Our pleural cavities surround the lungs. The mediastinum is actually this membranous partition between our pleural cavities and surrounding the great vessels of the heart and the pericardial cavity. So this we'll just say is a membranous partition surrounding the great vessels of the heart and the pericardium. And the pericardial cavity is the cavity that surrounds the heart, the pericardium and the heart. Okay, so those are our cavities, and these are going to be lined with serous membranes that we'll talk about in just a minute. Then inferior to the diaphragm, we have the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity is kind of superior to your pelvis, and that's where like your stomach, your liver, most of your intestines are. And the pelvic cavity is inferior to that, where your urinary bladder is, your colon, your reproductive organs, not all of your colon, like your sigmoid colon, rectum is all down there in the pelvic cavity. So your abdominal pelvic cavity is inferior to your diaphragm. And the abdominal part is kind of everything. If we look here, Alex can kind of show us. This is the abdominal cavity here. And the pelvic cavity is kind of everything that's surrounded by your kind of false pelvis and then true pelvis. So your pelvic cavity is really down here. You would have like your inferior part of your colon, your rectum, urinary bladder, and reproductive organs. So for your abdominal cavity, we'll say this houses most of your viscera, or most of your visceral organs. And your pelvic cavity houses your reproductive organs, your urinary bladder, your rectum, anus. Okay. All right, so the organs in the ventral cavity have to be friction resistant. The organs in your thoracic cavity are continuously moving. Your heart is always beating, and your lungs are expanding and relaxing as you breathe in and out. So we need them not to rub up against each other. And then the organs in your abdominal cavity are also always rubbing up against each other as you move around, but also as the material moves through them past each other. So we have to make sure that we're not actually feeling the organs rubbing up against each other, and we do that by surrounding the organs in the ventral cavity in these membranes called serosa, or serous membranes. Serous membranes are double-layered membranes that are secreting this stuff called serous fluid. So double-layered membranes that are separated by serous fluid. So what does this mean? Well, if I've got two layers, one layer is tightly covering the organ. The other layer is lining the cavity wall. Both layers are secreting serous fluid into the space between them, and then we don't get friction. So let's write all this stuff down, and then I will kind of talk you through an example. So parietal serosa lines the cavity wall. Visceral serosa covers the organ. So this is a double-layered membrane separated by serous fluid. So both of these layers secrete serous fluid into the space between them. So we could say both layers secrete serous fluid into the space between them. Which is the serous cavity. And serous fluid, this is thicker than water, and it reduces the friction. We'll say it reduces the friction between organs. Okay, so an analogy is like a balloon. If you think of a balloon like a serous membrane, you could take your fist and push it into the balloon. And the part of the balloon that is hugging your fist is like what? It's like the visceral layer. Okay, and then the rest of the balloon that's out here is like the parietal layer. And then all of the air is like the serous fluid. Okay, so that's what serous membranes are like. So, like, let's say this is my lung. Then I've got, here's my root of my lung coming into it. Then this is where it all folds over at. So, I've got my visceral pleura right here. And then it folds back on itself to give rise to the parietal pleura right there. And then in this cavity, I'm full of serous fluid. Okay, so that's how they work. So all of the organs in the ventral cavity have serous membranes. So we've got specific names for the serous membranes associated with each organ. The pericardium is actually unique. It's got 3 layers. It's the only one that has 3 layers. So we'll talk more about that next semester. And it has to have a 3rd fibrous layer that holds it anchored in the thorax so that it can continuously beat. But for now, we'll just talk about which organ each of these serous membranes are covering. So the pericardium is the serous membrane of the heart. Your pleural membranes or your pleura are the serous membranes of the lungs. The peritoneum is the serous membrane that surrounds most of the organs in your abdominal pelvic cavity, and it's continuous. So the serous membrane that surrounds your stomach is continuous with the serous membrane that surrounds your small intestine. Now, not all of your organs in your abdominal cavity are surrounded by serous membranes. For example, if we look here, your kidneys sit back here at the back of your abdominal cavity, and they continuously filter your blood to produce urine. So these don't need friction reduction. They actually need to be anchored to your abdominal cavity, and they are. So they're what we call retroperitoneal, outside or behind the peritoneum. So we'll talk more about the connective tissue coverings that they have next semester, but just be aware of that. Some parts of the small intestine are retroperitoneal, pancreas, retroperitoneal, but all the organs that are moving, your stomach, most of your small intestine, your large intestine, all of those things are covered in peritoneum. And this is continuous from one organ to the next. So peritoneum, this is the serous membrane of your abdominal pelvic cavity. And then like your urinary bladder, it's got peritoneum on top, but on the sides and bottom it's got adventitia to anchor it in the pelvic cavity. So just kind of be aware of that. We'll talk about the specifics when we get to the specific organs, but as a generality we need to be aware of this right now. So then the last thing that we need to talk about from chapter 1 are the abdominal pelvic quadrants and regions. So if we think about the abdominal pelvic cavity, that's everything from the diaphragm inferior. So it's inferior to the diaphragm and contains most of our viscera. So we split it into 2 ways, either the abdominal pelvic quadrants or the abdominal pelvic regions. So first let's look at quadrants and talk about what we'll find in each quadrant, and then we'll look at the way that we divide up the abdominal pelvic cavity as far as regions. So right here, this is the right upper quadrant, or the RUQ. Over here, this is the left upper quadrant, or the LUQ, and then we've got our right lower quadrant and our left lower quadrant. Okay, so those are the quadrants. And now, wait a minute, why is this right? It's the left side of the board. And why is that left? It's the right side of the board. And the reason is because of anatomical position. In anatomical position, we're considering where the person is or the body is. And so this is the right of the person's body, or the right upper quadrant. So things we would find in here: liver, gallbladder, your left kidney is back there. What else? We've got a little part of your stomach. We've got part of your transverse colon, part of your ascending colon. If we were to look down in your right lower quadrant, we would have your cecum, your appendix, small intestine. We would have your ascending colon. You would also have some a little bit of small intestine winding through your right upper quadrant. Over here, we'd have most of our stomach. We'd have our pancreas. We'd have our spleen. We'd have some more transverse colon and some descending colon. In the right lower in the left lower quadrant, what would we have? We'd have the rest of our descending colon, the sigmoid colon. In here, we'd have the urinary bladder between our lower quadrants. What else would we find in here? We'd find a lot of our small intestine. So go ahead and look in your book and have gander at figuring out what organs are in which quadrant. See if you could figure it out based on what the abdominal pelvic organs are. Could you figure out which is in each quadrant? And then the other way that we talk about the abdominal pelvic cavity is in regions, or 9 abdominal pelvic regions. So the abdominal pelvic regions, let's just draw it on top of these quadrants here and talk about it. So we all know that our belly button is like our umbilical region. We were attached to our mom through the umbilicus. So that's the first body region I always use, that's the first abdominal pelvic region I always use to kind of orient myself as to what's going on. So we've got 9 abdominal pelvic regions, and I use the one in the middle, the umbilical region, as my frame of reference. So this is my umbilical region. And then epi means upon, and hypo means below. So I'm going to use that to know what's above and below my umbilical region. Gastric refers to the stomach. There's no hypogastric region down here, but there is some stomach up here in the epigastric region. So epigastric, upon, and gastric. Upon the umbilical region, and it's got some stomach in it. This is my epigastric region. Below my umbilical region, I have my hypogastric region. All right, so umbilical region. Epigastric region's above it, hypogastric region's below it. What about on the left and right of it? Well, we all know we've got those lumbar supports in our car. It pokes out and pokes into here. Those are your lumbar regions. So here's my left and right lumbar region. Here's my right lumbar region. Okay, and when we were talking about body regions, I said that this groin region here was the inguinal region. This is the inguinal cavity here. Those are our inguinal regions. So if we look on the left and right side of the hypogastric region, we have our left and right inguinal regions. And then for our last two, what are flanking our epigastric region? Try to think of a way to remember this. These are the hypochondriac regions. And no, it's not that you're faking like you're sick. It's like maybe chondro is referring to cartilage. Chondrocytes are the cells that secrete cartilage. So the only thing I can think is that right below that, or hypo, right below all these costal cartilages from your thoracic cage, are your hypochondriac regions, maybe? Hypo, below the cartilage. So here, on the left and right of our epigastric regions, are left and right hypochondriac regions. So different jobs use different kind of regions or quadrants. I think EMTs use the regions a lot more, and then surgeons use quadrants. I'm not quite sure if that's exactly how it goes, but just be aware that we can split the abdominal pelvic cavity into quadrants and regions and have an idea of what's in each. So I could say something to you like, true or false, the left inguinal region contains stomach. And the answer would be false. The left inguinal region is down here. It contains some descending colon. It contains like your sigmoid colon. Well, your descending colon's coming through here and then curving into your descending colon. So your stomach's up here. There'd be no way we'd find it there. So have a general idea about what organ you find in each. Know the names of each of your regions and your quadrants. And that's about the level of detail you need to know from that. So that wraps up our first day of material in Chapter 1 in our Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. Study hard. I hope you are excited as I am. It'll be a great class. So see you soon.